Hi everyone, my name is Yusef and I'll be talking about a solar power application that we haven't spoken about yet, and my final thesis, which is titled When All Else Fails, a multiple case study analysis on decentralized solar power in Palestine. So to kick us off, there's a long history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that has created a reality on the ground that makes it practically impossible for an independent Palestinian economy to exist. Okay, this is due to a long history of Israeli colonial policy. It's imposed on Palestinians, such as the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, the annexation of land, their control of the borders, as well as the Gaza blockade. One of the realities that this has created is geographic fragmentation. As you can see on the right, on your left there, the West Bank and Gaza don't have any geographic continuity between them, making it really hard for them to have a unified economic system. Even within the West Bank, the darker shades here are areas called Area C, which are controlled by the Israeli military, where everything that happens in those, or anything that goes through those areas has to be approved by the Israeli military. That makes it very hard for large-scale infrastructure projects or anything of that sort to be implemented even within the West Bank. One of the main industries that's impacted by this is the energy sector in Palestine, where 95% of the energy is directly imported from Israel. This has created a reality where in Gaza there is as low as 4 hours of electricity a day. This means no running refrigerators, no lights, no running water, and you can imagine how hard that might be. This dynamic also allows Israel to impose energy sanctions on Palestinian communities as a form of collective punishment, which they regularly do. And on top of all of that, any payments made by Palestinian consumers towards their electricity bills goes directly into the pockets of an Israeli corporation, which they view as their occupier. Now, due to this reality, there has been an unprecedented increase in solar power projects across the West Bank and Gaza. And for my thesis, I took 4 case studies and looked at how they've been operating in this complex environment, as well as the impacts that they've had on their communities that they're serving. 2 of these case studies were based out of Gaza, and 2 others were in the West Bank, and they were mostly dealing with solar powers on roofs for a variety of clients. And the first thing that I looked at was how they've been operating, and I found that due to the fact that they were locally sourced solutions that were led by locals who were familiar with the complex environments, they were able to implement creative and innovative solutions to the many political and economic barriers and constraints that they face. And because of that, they were able to have an impact, which we'll be talking about, where across the board, we saw an increase in energy security and resilience. And this is especially true for marginalized communities in the West Bank and in contested areas, as well as in Gaza, where now people have their energy source directly on the roof, and nothing is blocking them in the sun, and no one, for the most part, can take that away from them. Okay, this has also led to other benefits, like the financial benefits, where 80 to 100% reduction in bills for these households due to the high cost of electricity from the grid, as well as the 330 sunny days a year in Palestine. This is a very important point because that means a reduction in the amount of money that these households are paying directly to their occupiers. Also, we see an increased reliability because people have now more energy access for longer periods of the day. This allows them to also increases food security and health because now they can run their refrigerators more often and keep their foods more fresh, as well as farmers can now deploy more high-tech technologies that allow them to help their production processes in their farms. Other impacts are the educational impact, where students now can study more often and have access to resources like the internet and television, which they previously did not. And last but not least, the environmental impact. Other than the obvious reduction in CO2 emissions, there's also the fact that farmers in rural areas can now deploy high-tech machinery systems like water systems that allow them to use water more efficiently and save that natural resource. So in conclusion, I found that due to the fact that these were locally sourced and locally led solutions allowed them to have the impact that we just discussed in this very complex political and economic environment. However, what lacks in Palestine is the strong institutional support, as well as the regulatory framework that would allow for things like feed-in tariffs and net metering, which I believe would increase the incentives for the growth and scaling of such projects. However, I think that if these were implemented, pairing them with the locally led and the locally sourced solutions would allow us to see and scale the maintaining and scaling of the impact that I just spoke about. Thank you.
How are these companies taking care of the affordability of these solar panels, especially for the rural areas?
Yeah, so most of these companies are running like hybrid models. Okay, so first of all, most of them are importing these panels from China at relatively low prices, and so middle class families are able to afford them. But what they're doing is some of them are hiking up the prices for the higher income families and using that to subsidize for rural areas. Other case studies have donor funding that allows them to do for the marginalized communities specifically, but they run a for-profit when they're doing for middle income and institutions who have their own money.
For storage, not just 24 hours.
Yeah, storage. So
people have batteries.
Yeah, so it's like I forgot the exact size, but I don't have that on top of my head. But they're like a car battery. That's the most basic one. It's 2 or 3 panels and a battery. Yeah.
Are you a little worried? So I think the locally sourced, locally led solutions, decentralized makes a lot of sense. Are you a little worried that if it becomes strong institutional with net metering and kind of government regulatory framework, that tensions between Hamas and Fatah could turn this into a political tool?
I think, good question, but Hamas is running in Gaza, right? And Fatah is running in the West Bank, and just the reality on the ground doesn't really seem much space for that confrontation to happen. So if the Palestinian Authority were to implement net metering or feed-in tariffs, that would probably be more applicable in the West Bank, and then you would have to get Hamas on your side to do that in Gaza. So you're 2 separate cases that don't really, that's part of the problem too.
I imagine that Israel's not particularly happy with this situation if it were to scale. How are the locals actually bringing in the solar panels?
Yeah, so that's, again, I wouldn't say that the Israelis are not happy with that. I don't have any evidence to say that they're not happy. But on that point specifically, I had access to minutes from a meeting that I think the World Bank representative in that meeting mentioned Israeli warning letter when they were talking about solar power, so I'm not sure. And there's also some cases in the Bedouin villages in contested Area C, which I mentioned, where they confiscate that, but the entrepreneurs there have implemented creative ways of getting around that. But regarding your question of importing them, in the West Bank, the reality is if you have the business license, legally you're allowed to import it, but you have to get approval from the Israeli military, and they do that. However, that doesn't stop them from holding on to their materials for a long time. There were some cases where they would hold on to their materials, leave them outside for months, and then when the company finally receives them, they're broken and not working. And there are times where you have to pay them bribe or something of that sort. In Gaza, a little more complicated. Initially, the two cases in Gaza that I have are like small-scale private companies, startups. They started with underground stuff. They also had underground tunnels. They also had connections with the United Nations where they would get some of the panels through like the big UN trucks, so they get a few panels here and a few panels there. But largely, recently it's been more legal, and there hasn't been any pushback from the Israeli military until they feel like confiscating and breaking some. It's kind of,
Can you briefly describe net metering in terms?
Yeah, so the idea behind that is, so when you have solar powers on your roof, in California for example, and even if you have a battery or you don't, any excess energy that you're producing, you can sell back to the utility company. So, and that's a financial incentive because you're getting that back. Or there's other forms where you give them back the excess energy, but when you do need grid energy, they're giving it to you at a lower price or even for free. So while a lot of these households and institutions are connected to the grid, especially in the West Bank, that kind of framework doesn't exist. So any excess energy that they're producing goes into the grid, which is good, but they're not getting anything in return.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, if you had the chance to see a bit of a government perspective in all this, because I know one of the big things in Argentina when the idea of importing solar panels from China came was first the reliability of the solar panels in terms of not being reliable and probably doing that this new technology not being trustable. And second, the idea of providing a national industry that can compete with the low prices of things.
Yeah, so the government perspective, so these are private companies that are importing from China, so it's their decision. The government really doesn't have much to say. But the Palestinian government, have been recently caught up with this new purchasing power agreement that they're doing with Israel regarding energy sources, and I think it just recently passed. So they haven't been really thinking about solar power that much. There are some utility scale projects that they're doing on the municipal level, and there is like this vague goal of doing 10% energy, renewable energy by the end of the year. My time is up, but there's a couple more.
Just one more.
All right.
What's the alternative source of energy for many people? Is it diesel or the...
Yeah, for the marginalized communities, it's diesel-generated powers.
so then the solar energy is a good business.
100%, yeah. And other than that, the grid, obviously, as I mentioned, comes from Israel, which they have natural gas and oil.